I ate this for 7 days and my memory came back. The doctors were shocked. I know how that sounds. It sounds like a headline, like something you scroll past between miracle cures and clickbait. But before you decide what to think, hear me out. I need to tell you why I tried it, what my life felt like before that week, and how a very small, deliberate habit began to pull me back from a place where I was losing more than names and dates. I was losing myself. Quick note, because I believe in plain talk. I'm not a doctor. This is my personal story, my experience. If anything I say prompts you to try something like this, please talk to your physician first. I won't tell you to stop your medications or replace a doctor's advice with food. That is not my place. If you've noticed blank moments in someone you love, or you felt like a stranger in your own life, please comment below. I read every message. Hearing other people's stories kept me going when I couldn't even find my own words. My husband, João, and I had a ritual. Coffee at 6, 2 mugs side by side on the kitchen table, the one on the left for him, the one on the right for me. The last mug for 2 sits in my memory like a photograph. A thin ring of coffee staining the porcelain, steam rising, the radio murmuring news we never listened to. The house we shared for 40 years had windows that looked out over jacaranda trees and a small garden where João planted tomatoes we'd forget to pick. When he died, the house felt larger in the worst way, every room echoing his absence. A year later, my daughter Luciana called and said there wasn't any reason for me to stay alone in such a big house. "Come live with us," she said, voice practical, like she was arranging furniture. So I sold the house, packed the photograph albums, and moved into Luciana's house with her, Roberto, her husband, and their 2 children, Pedrinho and Julia. On paper, it was what everyone thought I wanted: close family, laughter at the table, the smell of baking. In reality, the move was the beginning of a slow erosion I didn't notice until it had already eaten away the edges of my life. Luciana's house had a small skylight above the narrow hallway, a claraboia, and I used to lie awake some nights and watch the stars through it. The first nights there, I would wake and whisper João's name. The syllables tumbled out before I remembered he wasn't there to answer. Later, I'd find myself stirring the pot at midnight, washing a sink full of dishes because the children had left a storm of plates and the house hum was louder when I wasn't busy. Once, at 10:30, I opened the pantry and stood there, holding a jar of sugar, and could not remember why I'd come into the kitchen. That blank feeling, like a small light extinguished in my head, frightened me more than anything I had known. It didn't help that my new role was undefined and heavy. I was helpful at first. Of course I cooked. Of course I made the sweets for the children. Of course I ran errands. There were brigadeiros to fold and roll for birthday parties. I rolled them with practiced fingers, cocoa across the kitchen counter, and the kids' laughter braided with the sound of the mixer. But slowly, that kindness became default. I was mother, grandmother, unpaid helper, and then something smaller, a fixture. I cleaned until my knuckles ached. I learned the children's school rhythms. I became the person who knew where the lost socks were. But nobody asked how I was. The house was full of noise, but it felt lonely in a way I had not expected. There were moments of humiliation wrapped in concern. One afternoon, Luciana's friend, Carmen, someone I'd met at the community center years ago when I used to teach adults to read, rang the bell unexpectedly. I opened the door in an old cardigan and offered her coffee. She looked at my hands on the mug and asked how I was sleeping. "You look tired, Geralda," she said softly. Later, I overheard Luciana on the phone, voice low. "I think Mom forgets things more and more. I'm worried it might be dementia." The word hung in my ear. It's amazing how a single word, when said in a tone of practical worry, can rearrange your stomach. I tried to laugh it off. No, I told them, because what else was there to say? I was 73 and felt like I was losing the map of my life. But there came a moment, a small, brittle moment, that broke me free from pretending. It was the day I forgot Pedrinho's name at a school play. He was up on stage in a paper crown, looking smaller against the bright lights than he had in my memory, and when I clapped and called out, a blankness opened, and the name that used to be instinctive was gone from me for one long breath. My throat closed. That evening I went to bed early and, for the first time in that house, slept until 10 o'clock in the morning, a silly, small rebellion against the schedule that had become my life. When I woke and walked to the skylight, the glass was cool under my palm, and the stars were there, indifferent and silent. I told myself I would not be defined by forgetfulness, not like Joan had been defined by a slow illness in his last years, not like I might be defined by other people's fear. I have always been a person who acts. Waiting for others to decide what to do with your life is a slow kind of death. So I began looking for things I could control, not to prove anybody wrong, not to prove anything really, but to feel agency under my own feet again. I started with the small. 7 days, I told myself. 7 mornings of a single thing, a ritual I could keep in my hands and measure. If it changed nothing, I would have at least tried. If it did something, I would have evidence, my own personal, small evidence. I chose a simple thing, a blueberry and walnut smoothie every morning. Blueberries are sweet and tart. Walnuts have a texture that keeps your teeth company. You can buy both at any market, and for me, it felt like the kind of sensible thing an old woman would do without fuss. I didn't choose an exotic herb or a pill I couldn't spell. I chose food I recognized. I mixed a handful of blueberries, a small handful of walnuts, a splash of yogurt, a drizzle of honey, and a cup of milk, or almond milk on days my stomach felt particular. I pureed it until it smelled like summer and nuttiness, a smell that made me think of João's garden and the small, ordinary pleasures of morning. I timed it, too. 7 days, every morning at 9, the same mug, a chipped white one I liked because it fit my hand. Ritual matters. When you are trying to tip a life back towards something steadier, the small ceremonies tether you. Day 1 tastes like hope and skepticism. The smoothie was cold and sweet, and it woke my mouth up. I drank it slowly, sitting by the narrow window in the kitchen where the light fell in a strip on the counter. I held the mug the way I used to hold João's hand while he read the newspaper. That afternoon, I made a grocery list without having to cross out items and wonder why they'd been written. It felt ordinary, but the lack of a blank moment felt like a small victory. Day 2. I woke up before 9 on instinct, which surprised me. The kettle whistled, not because I'd said it, but because my body had remembered routine. I made the smoothie, and between sips, I found myself reciting the names of the grandchildren when I put the sugar back on the shelf. It was small again, but it stopped the hollow fear that had been waiting to swallow me whole. Day 3 felt different, and I remember it clearly, because I called it to Carmen that evening when she stopped by. I think I feel a little sharper, I told her. She grinned, the kind of grin that folds the face into relief. I told Luciana you'd want to get out more, she said. That night, I sat by the skylight and watched a sliver of the moon and felt a curiosity bloom that had been absent for months. It was not dramatic. It was a soft, distant light that had been obscured by clouds and now gleamed through. But I was careful. Each improvement I felt, I wrote down in a small notebook. This was my proof to myself. On the 4th morning, I noticed I could remember the route to a friend's house without stopping to ask directions. On the 5th, I finished a crossword that had defeated me for a week. On the 6th, I found a photograph of João I hadn't seen in months wedged between cookery books, and I remembered exactly the day it was taken. The way his hat had slopped to one side, the way his shoulders had been hunched against the wind.
That kind of recall felt less like a flash and more like a returning neighbor waving hello. Alongside the days, the house's rhythms began to shift.
The midnight dishes still happened. The children are children, and there will always be plates. But I stopped waking at odd hours to do them out of a compulsion I could not explain. One evening, Luciana came into the kitchen and found me at the counter rolling brigadeiros for a small school party. She looked at me and, for the first time in a long time, said, "Mom, why don't you rest tonight?" There was concern in her voice, but also something gentler, a pause that suggested she was wondering whether the way things had been was right at all. Her question felt like a small hand offering me permission to not be everything at once. There were moments that startled me with their trivial domesticity. On day 4, I fixed the loose button on Luciana's coat while she talked about a problem at work. I threaded the needle easily, and she laughed at how quick I was. When she left the room, she touched my arm and squeezed. "Thanks, Mom," she said. It was not dramatic, but it held warmth. These little scenes began fitting together like a pattern I could trace. A woman who could still sew, who could still make the smell of lemon and sugar into joy for small hands, who could still remember the jokes Pedrino made at breakfast. Still, fear lingered. At night, when the house was quiet and the skylight was a black coin of sky, I would imagine the worst. I would imagine failing at something bigger, walking out of the house and not knowing how to get home. So every morning I wrote in my small notebook what I had done. Drank smoothie, called friend, remembered the date of the dentist, sewed button. The list became proof. It was my running testimony to myself. There were also stinging little moments of family friction, because love gets clumsy when people are scared. Roberto, Luciana's husband, would sometimes make jokes about forgetfulness that were meant to be light but landed heavy. "You're getting soft in the head, Generalda," he would say. And I knew he didn't mean cruelty. His father had been forgetful too, and his words came tangled with fear. I held my tongue and reminded myself that none of this was about blame. It was about protection, their attempt to guard me, and my insistence not to be wrapped so tight I had no room to breathe. By day 7, I had a ritual down. Smoothie at 9, walk to the park for 5 minutes, make lunch, sit by the skylight and read a chapter of an old book. That last day, something clearer happened that made me stop folding the napkins and sit down hard as if the wind had knocked me. I was at a stoplight waiting to cross, and a phrase from an old church song I hadn't thought of in 20 years rose up fully formed in my head. Not a fragment, the whole line, the melody, the way my mother used to hum it while making the bed. I stood there with the sound inside my head and understood with a clarity that made my thread had not been severed after all. It made the week worth it, almost regardless of what came next. I told Luciana I planned to make an appointment with the clinic. It felt like a responsible thing to do, to check not because I doubted my progress, but because I wanted an outside voice to measure what I had felt inside. Before I went to the doctor, I said it again because I wanted it said out loud. I'm not a doctor. This is an anecdote from my life. If you consider trying anything similar, speak with your medical professional first. There is a small, unglamorous part of me that wanted the clinic to be the final arbiter. Part of me wanted a white coat to announce, "Yes, you've improved." And part of me wanted them to be baffled, so that the drab, shrinking part of my life would be shown a mirror and return my reflection more luminous. I know that sounds dramatic, and it was. Old people get dramatic sometimes. We have long histories to compress into small moments. Before I stepped out that day to call for an appointment, a memory tugged at me. The last time I stood at the stove making brigadeiros, Pedrino had reached up and smeared chocolate across his cheek with the kind of abandon children have. He'd looked at me and laughed, and his joy lubricated something that had been stuck. That little face came back to me,
and I realized the week had not only brought back names and dates, it had reopened a channel to tender moments I thought were behind me. I told myself the appointment would be procedural. A little questionnaire, some basic tests, and a professional's calm. But there was a private thrill at the idea that someone in a white coat might say they were surprised. Not because a smoothie cured anything, but because sometimes the thing that surprises the doctor is not one single item on the plate, but the sum of decisions a person makes to take their life back. And that is the thing I want to make clear before I go on. This week was not a promise of universal cure. It was a deliberate act of care toward myself. The smoothie was a ritual, a spoonful of structure in a time when my days had been porous and shapeless. The real change was not the blueberries alone. It was the decision to do something for me, to make a list and follow it and mark progress in ink. The food was an anchor, and the anchor steadied me enough to move. When I called the clinic, my hands were not as steady as I would have liked. I spoke with the receptionist who recognized my name. It turns out time does a funny thing. The person who once taught adult literacy classes was known to the clinic volunteers. They fitted me into a schedule. The earliest slot was in 2 weeks. "Is it urgent?" the woman asked. I surprised myself by saying, "Not urgent, but I would like to have a baseline." The woman's voice softened. Perhaps she understood that a baseline is a kind of map when a person fears they have lost the road. In the days before the appointment, people around me began to notice. Carmen stopped by more often and brought me a jar of tea. Roberto began leaving a note on the fridge, "Buy milk." Luciana, sometimes watching me with a caution that was almost tenderness, asked if I felt better. She placed her hand on my shoulder as if to anchor me, but also to test the new ground beneath my feet. On an evening 2 nights before the clinic visit, I sat by the skylight and rolled a Brigadeiro slowly between my fingers while the kids watched a cartoon. The chocolate stuck to my skin, and I licked it off and thought of Juan. He used to laugh when I made too many sweets and say, "Stop feeding the whole neighborhood, Geralda." I laughed quietly then, and the laugh felt like a small return to myself, to the ability to be amused, to feel light. When the morning of the appointment arrived, I wrapped a scarf around my neck, the one Zhuang had given me on our 50th wedding anniversary. I took the small notebook and the scanned list of the week's notes in my bag. I felt both foolish and brave. My heart fluttered like the wings of a small bird. On the bus, I watched young mothers with strollers and men with briefcases and felt an odd kinship across ages. We are all carrying things that make us move in certain ways, I thought. I walked into the clinic and sat in a chair that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old magazines. The receptionist called my name. I stood and followed her down a corridor full of framed prints and club calendars. In the waiting room, a woman my age sat knitting. She looked up as I passed and smiled. "You look well," she said. I smiled back, and the smile felt like currency. They took me in a small, efficient room. The nurse asked me questions, simple ones, the kind that test attention. "What day is it? Can you subtract 7 from 100?" And I answered. I surprised myself by answering without catching my breath. I found that the week had rewritten a few of the scripts I used in my head for how old age would behave. I was not, as I had feared, a passive thing waiting for the tide to decide my shape. When the nurse finished, she told me the doctor would be in a moment. I sat and smoothed the fabric of my skirt and thought of the skylight and the way the moon had looked a week ago. Ahead of me, in the small medical room, someone in a white coat would say something. Perhaps they would be surprised. Perhaps they would not be. Whatever they said, I decided I had done the essential work. I had acted for myself. I shifted in the chair as the door opened and the doctor came in, clipboard in hand. He greeted me politely, and I found myself being articulate in a way I hadn't expected, telling him about the week, about the smoothie, about the notebook. I watched him listen and make notations, his pen scratching. He asked a few clinical-sounding questions, and then leaned back and said something that made me blink.
But I will tell you about that in a moment. Because I want to be careful with words that can be heavy and easily misunderstood. For now, let me stop here and say this. The 7 days were more than a palate cleanser. They were a declaration, a small rebellion against being made small. They were a practice in noticing. They taught me that memory is not only an archive of facts, it is a living room where you sit and watch your life reassemble itself. The week put me back on a path toward decisions, renting a small apartment again, reconnecting with the people who had given me purpose, teaching adults to read like I used to do. I walked out of the clinic that day with a paper in my hand and a head full of questions. The doctor had said something that made my hands tremble in a good way, something that hinted at surprise but also at caution. I walked into the sun and felt the light on my face like permission. There is more to tell, about the exact words the doctor used, about what I decided to do after that appointment, about how Luciana and Roberto shifted, about how the neighborhood center came to mean something new for me. There is more about the way I learned to set boundaries without guilt, to say no to midnight dishes when my body asked for rest, to reclaim the right to sleep until 10 once in a while, and to watch the stars through my skylight without apology. But that I will tell you next. For now, hold this image. A woman who had been afraid she would vanish, opening her hands to a small bowl of berries and nuts every morning, writing down each small victory and feeling a little more like herself again. If that resonates with you, if you have a similar story, a similar fear, or a small ritual that helped, please share it in the comments. I believe our small acts can be contagious in a good way. And remember, I'm not a doctor. This is my personal anecdote. Talk to a medical professional before changing your diet or treatment. He sat down across from me with a pen that seemed to hesitate on the paper. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 40s, wearing a sweater the color of hospital walls and shoes that had seen 1,000 corridors. He listened while I told him, plainly, the small litany of habits I had started. The notebook with its neat entries, the walk to the park, the chipped white mug, and the blueberry walnut smoothie at 9 o'clock every morning. I told him I did not expect miracles. I told him I wanted a baseline, something to hold up against the days when my head felt fogged. Then he asked the questions doctors ask: the date, the name of the city, a subtraction problem that felt oddly like a schoolroom memory test. I answered, and for a moment the room smelled like antiseptic and lemon soap and the memory of a kitchen where Juan used to whistle. When he looked up from his notes, his expression was gentle, professional, yes, but with a tiny lift at the corner of his eyes that I had learned to read over the years as curiosity more than judgment. "I'm not going to say 1 week proves anything," he said, the sentence careful as someone navigating a tile floor. "But I will tell you, I didn't expect to see such a consistent pattern in your answers compared to your reported baseline." He explained that tests could be influenced by many things: sleep, routine, mood, hydration, and recommended a follow-up, some simple cognitive screening, and perhaps a review with a neurologist if anything else seemed inconsistent. He wrote a note for further evaluation and told me to keep doing what I felt helped me feel steady. When I left the clinic, my hands were tingling, not with a victory lap, but with the sense of a small reprieve. The doctor's words were not a certificate. They were a mirror held up to a moment I already knew had shifted. He had been surprised, yes. He admitted as much to the nurse later in a hallway as I walked past, but he framed it as clinical curiosity, not miracle. That is how I wanted it. It felt honest.
Remember, I say again because it matters to me, I am not a physician. This is my story. If you hear something here that makes you want to try a similar ritual, please talk with your doctor first. Don't stop medications. Don't replace medical advice with a recipe you find on the internet. That line is a hard one to draw, and I wanted to make sure mine was clear. What followed the appointment was not a parade of sudden sweeping change. It was quieter and stranger. It was more like a series of doors opening along a hallway I had thought led only to the kitchen and the skylight. The movement began with a conversation at the kitchen table that I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks. "Luciana," I said one evening while the kids were at a sleepover and Roberto was at work, "I think it's time I had my own place again. Not far, something with a window that opens on the street. I want a little kitchen where I can put my radio and maybe a chair by the window." She looked up from her phone, and for a moment I braced for the surprise I imagined would run across her face. Instead, she folded her hands and looked at me as if seeing me for the first time in a while. No, not for the first time, but as if the sight of me had been clarified by something she'd only just remembered. "Mom," she said, and there was a soft steadiness in her voice I had missed. "If you want that, we'll make it happen. Marcos can help with the boxes." Marcos, my son, arrived 2 days later with a borrowed van and a dozen boxes heaped like little houses in the back. He had been the one to call a few times after I first mentioned leaving, not to tell me not to, but to ask how I wanted to do it. He packed slowly and with precision, folding tea towels like they were small promises. Roberto, who had carried the worry of his own father's memory issues like a heavy coat, blinked and offered to help with moving the furniture, awkwardly asking whether I wanted him to stay and help set up the kettle. I found a small apartment 3 blocks from the community center where I used to teach adults to read. It was modest, a studio with a narrow balcony, a bit of peel in the paint, and a window that opened wide enough to let me stand with my face to the air. Most important to me was the light. The skylight had been a private star. This window looked out across a street where people came and went, young men carrying bags of fruit, mothers with prams, a stray cat that liked to dawdle at the corner. I felt unseen by no one at that window. I could watch life happen and be part of it. Moving felt like shedding an old coat and discovering the seams of a new sweater. There was labor, lifting boxes, sweeping dust, arranging jars of spices so they smiled from the shelf. But it was labor I had chosen. For the first few nights, I slept a little later without guilt, letting the alarm be a suggestion rather than a command. I made the smoothie at 9 exactly as I had for the week before, sat by the window, and ate breakfast with the radio murmuring in a language that had once been the soundtrack to my life. The bowl of blueberries and chopped walnut became an emblem of my small sovereignty, not because it had miraculous properties, but because it marked a decision I had kept. The center, the little brick building with a painted sign and a bell that chimed when Carmen opened the door, welcomed me like a harbor. Carmen had been there when I first taught reading years ago. She hugged me the moment I walked in and cried a little, not from pity, but from joy. "We kept a class seat for you," she said, and I found my cheeks wet as she pushed my hand into someone else's warm palm. The students were different faces now. Ana, a seamstress who wanted literacy for business licensing. Juan Paulo, a quiet man with a laugh like a pocket knife. Maria, who folded her hands like a prayer when she read aloud. I began teaching again twice a week, the syllables and small victories weaving themselves into my days. Teaching was not only a return of a skill, it was an argument I made to the world about who I was. Standing in front of a small group and guiding someone through the sound of a letter felt like declaring, with no illusions and no need to be loud, that I had a place and a purpose. When Ana read the paragraph about licensing and leaned back with the effort and triumph writ on her face, I felt it like someone putting warm bread into my hands. Those small domestic scenes, the smell of lemon when I made coffee for the class, the rustle of paper, the scrape of a pen, were stitches in a life that had been loosened. At home, boundaries began to settle into a new shape. I learned to say, "Not tonight," when midnight dishes called. I learned to accept help when delivery men brought small parcels and to pay someone to come in on Saturdays if I wanted time to organize my vegetable patch. These were not selfish acts, but reclaims of space I had allowed to be occupied by habit. Luciana, at first hesitant, grew into a companion who asked permission before setting chores on me. She would call in the morning to ask if I'd like company for lunch rather than assume my availability. Those small shifts in tone mattered. They said, without pronouncing guilt, that the family was changing how it cared. The night Luciana sat across from me and said, "Mom, I'm sorry," was more ordinary than dramatic, but it felt like a confession and a healing wrapped in one. She apologized for the time she'd made decisions for me without asking, for the evenings she'd kept me awake with expectations that were more hers than mine. I listened, and when she reached out to take my hand, I felt the pressure of her apology as real as any physical weight. "I was scared," she said. "I thought if I didn't manage things, something bad would happen." I nodded. "Fear does strange things." "I know," I said, "and I'm grateful, but I also needed to remember my own map." Roberto softened too. He began to join the community center's small volunteer roster on weekends, sometimes helping with furniture or chopping up apples for the children's group. He learned to be careful with his jokes and to replace them with offers. "Can I carry those boxes to your car?" he would ask. The change was not immediate, but it was steady. Family life shifted from a pattern of assumed roles to a conversation of choices. People at the center noticed that my classes carried a certain patience and humor. We celebrated small things with modest cakes and coffee. I still rolled brigadeiros sometimes for the children who came to events, but now it was by choice and laughter, not a duty that eroded my evenings. I taught an evening class where a man named Sergio, who had never had the chance to finish school, read his first paragraph aloud and wept. He put his hand to his chest as if holding the words inside like a secret. After the class, Carmen and I stayed late and talked about how small rituals, reading a newspaper headline aloud, making a shopping list, helped people anchor a day. There were afternoons when I would sit on my narrow balcony, the cup of coffee cooling on the iron rail, and think about Juan. The photograph of him with the lopsided hat still sat on my shelf. Sometimes I would bring it out, tuck the frame between my hands, and remember the way he used to hum while frying onions. Those memories had been there all along. They had just been sanded down by worry and expectation. The week of the smoothie had not conjured them back from nothing. It had cleared enough dust for them to breathe. One evening, a small neighborhood newspaper ran a short piece about the community center's literacy program with a photograph that included me, laughing with a student who had just finished his first book. When I read the lines aloud on my balcony, they felt a little strange. My name in print, the record of a modest joy. The piece led to an invitation to speak at a neighborhood meeting about intergenerational care. I told them plainly that caring was a practice and that autonomy must be part of it. I said in the simplest terms that adults, older adults, should be allowed to keep dignity as much as safety. The applause was gentle and kind. It did not solve everything, but it was another small human confirmation that my voice mattered. Not every day was cheerful. Some days the old fears returned like weather, a wet, dull heaviness that made the kitchen light feel dim. I admitted that to my notebook. I wrote down the days I woke with a hollow ache, and I called a friend when it felt too big. On one of those evenings, Luciana arrived with a thermos and the kids trailing behind, and she sat down and said, "Tell me what you need." That question, simple and honest, emptied the cupboard of assumptions and made space for negotiation. We talked about meals, about babysitting schedules, about the nights when noise would be too much for me. It was not dramatic, just practical, rearranging life so it could work for all of us. There were practical steps I took as well. I kept my appointments at the clinic. The doctor had suggested some basic screenings to get a clearer sense of my cognitive baseline. I did them with a kind of patience I had not expected to find in myself. The results were, in medical terms, not startling. They showed some of the normal age-related changes you might expect, and nothing that demanded immediate alarm. The doctor advised me to keep up routines that supported sleep and social engagement, and to continue monitoring things with my family's support. He said he'd seen cases where people's moods and routines changed symptoms considerably, an observation that, to him, was as interesting as any test score. After those months, what surprised me most was how ordinary the victory felt. There were no confetti moments. There were just mornings when I remembered a name, afternoons when I sewed a button, evenings when the children bounced into my kitchen and I rolled brigadeiros with sure hands. The accumulation of those ordinary acts made up the restoration. Not a miracle in a headline sense, but a reclaiming of a life with texture. Sometimes people ask me, incredulously, whether the doctor was really shocked. I understand why. The phrase makes a good headline. The truth is softer. He was curious and pleasantly surprised by the pattern of improvement I described. He saw the value in a person taking intentional steps to care for herself, and he reminded me that lifestyle, sleep, diet, routine, social connection can influence how a person functions day to day. That is not to say that food cures medical conditions. It is to say that a person's choices, combined with medical oversight, can shift the experience of living with age. The neighbors called me the woman with the blue mug. A small boy from the corner bakery would wave at me like a solemn ambassador of pastry, and I would tuck a blueberry into my pocket to eat later like a secret. Pedrino and Julia came to visit more often, not out of duty, but to see the new place that smelled slightly of lemon and paint and hope. We read picture books at 3 in the afternoon and argued about which stories were the best. These tiny rituals were as nourishing as any breakfast I might have had. Marcos and I visited Juan's grave on a Sunday that felt like the kind of gentle weather he would have appreciated. I stood with my hands tucked inside my coat pockets and felt the familiar ache of loss. Then, as we walked back, I told him about the class that had read the whole paragraph without stopping, and about the man who had cried when he identified a word. He listened, and when I finished, he said, "You did that. You got up and did that." Sometimes we need others to say the obvious to us. I used to think independence meant being alone. I learned that it means choosing who to share your life with, how to let people help you without losing yourself, and how to set rules that protect your time and your dignity. I also learned that a small ritual, a bowl of berries and nuts, a walked path to a park bench, a notebook with dates, can act as a hinge on which a person's days swing. People at the center started asking for a Geralda corner, where they could display the little crafts we made and the certificates students earned. Carmen hung a small sign in my handwriting above a shelf that read, "Stories and Small Triumphs." The sign made my eyes wet in a way that had nothing to do with sorrow. It had everything to do with being seen. Once, while making brigadeiros for a local fair, a young woman approached the table. Her fingers were marked with ink and flour, and she said shyly that she had tried the morning routine I described after watching a short clip Luciana posted. "Just the smoothie and a list," she said. "I didn't expect much, but on day 3 I put my keys in my purse without thinking, and I almost cried." She laughed and then looked at me with a softness I recognized. "I wanted to tell you that it helped me start seeing my day differently." We sat and talked about small rituals, about what it means to be careful with yourself. She reminded me that sometimes what you do for yourself is a model for others. I told her I was glad and that the credit belonged to the ordinary courage of deciding to keep a promise to yourself. There were times I felt the old ache, the blankness, the fear, and I honored those days too. Recovery, or reclamation, is not a linear march. It is a back and forth of progress and reflection. The notebook continued to be my map. Some entries are bright with small triumphs. Helped Anna read instructions, found ticket in coat pocket, taught class. Others are quiet. Slept badly, phoned Marcos. Both kinds of notes mattered. People sometimes ask if I would have done things differently with hindsight. Maybe I would have had harder conversations earlier. Maybe I would have set boundaries sooner. But regret is a kind of heavy glove I no longer like to wear. Instead, I keep the light things, the small cups of coffee, the bristling of pages in a book, the sound of laughter when someone reads a sentence aloud for the first time. Those are the currencies I trade in now. If you are watching and you feel the pinch of that old smallness, if you find yourself performing kindness until your hands ache and nobody asks how you are, then I want to tell you what I would tell my own sister if she sat across from me now. It is permitted to choose yourself. It is permitted to set a boundary and to make a small ritual that is yours alone. It is permitted to ask for help without feeling that you have failed. And it is crucial to use medical resources with wisdom. Consult a physician, keep your treatments, and talk to professionals about any troubling symptoms. I will not pretend that a ball of fruit and nuts is a miracle cure. It was, for me, an accessible ritual that gave me a shape to my mornings, and thus a shape to my intentions. It anchored me to small acts that built up. The doctor's curiosity was part of the story, and their cautious praise did not invalidate the slow labor of reclaiming a life. The week of the smoothie was a hinge, not a fix. The real work was the months that followed, the choices, the appointments kept, the classes taught, the boundaries honored. Today, the nights are quieter in a different way. I still love to look at the stars through the old skylight when I visit Luciana, but I sleep with my window open and the city sounds filling the room like a blanket. I teach twice a week, and on Thursdays I sit at the little table in my apartment and write letters the old-fashioned way. Occasionally, I still forget a name. We are human, and time leaves its marks. But the blankness is no longer a cavern. It is a room I can enter, find my footing, and leave again. Sometimes the doctor I saw sends a note asking how I'm doing. He writes that he's glad I came in when I did, and that he's happy to continue monitoring things if needed. I appreciate the medical voice as part of my chorus. I also appreciate the human voices, Carmen's laughter, Luciana's steadying presence, Marco's practical hands, Roberto's gradual gentleness, and the students who remind me each week of the work of learning and the dignity it brings. If anything from my story resonates with you, if you have walked a similar corridor of being made small and wanted to find a way back into the room, I would love to hear it. Share your experience in the comments. One short note is enough. Your small acts matter more than you know. And one last time, because I would rather be plain than misleading. I am not a physician. This is my personal anecdote. If you consider trying a new food or routine like the one I described, speak with a medical professional first. Do not stop medications or alter treatments without professional guidance. If this touched you, subscribe for more stories like mine, and join a community that believes small, steady choices can restore dignity at any age. Thank you for listening.